In this unit, we'll look at some ways to create anchors and bridges. Anchors are things that we create to use as attachment points, something that can act as a live edge equivalent. An anchor can be as simple as the wrapped bass chord you probably used to start your very first looping sample, but anchors can be other things too. We'll look at some other options later in Lesson 1. For now, let's focus on anchoring to a three-dimensional object. To begin building a freeform sheath for this travel mug, I'm using a double needle chain that goes around the narrowest part of the mug. That will give me an edge to stitch into. From that edge, I can bridge out to create additional anchor points and to define some arbitrary boundaries that I'll fill in with freeform looping. Needle chains were used in New Age looping basics and crossknit looping, and crossknit included the double needle chain. Until you've done it a few times though, the hardest part with the double needle chain is getting started. So let's look at it again. For the double needle chain, you work 2 parallel needle chains at the same time, alternating your stitches between the two. When you begin, pay close attention to where the working thread lies. Remember, the needle always passes over the working thread. So after one stitch, you throw the thread so that the needle can pass over it when you finish the pair. Let's take a closer look here. To get started the first time, you might want to make a slip knot where you pull up the tail of the thread, as you do when beginning a round base. Since I'm right-handed, I hold the slip knot loop to the right, then I make a simple loop with the thread to the left. Pinch those 2 loops between your non-dominant thumb and index finger. Now go back to the first loop, insert the needle, and pass it over the working thread as you would for a single needle chain. Then, instead of working into that link, throw the thread, in this case to the left, and insert the needle into the link on the left and pass it over the working thread. That completes a pair of side-by-side links in your double chain. Continue by working alternately to the right and then the left side. I always try to finish a pair with the link on the left in case I have to stop partway through a chain, so it's easier to orient and get started when I pick up the chain to finish it. Once the chain is long enough to go around the vessel, I pull the last link tight to lock the chain, then stitch the end of the chain to the beginning to make a secure anchor point and a live edge for stitching. You'll notice that my thread wasn't quite long enough to work the chain without having to add on. To add on here, I just hold the old and new tails together and start stitching with the new thread. I'll trap those tails with my stitching later when I work the filling in that area. Before we continue, for now I'm just going to talk about the technique you're seeing in the video. I'll address the design considerations that technique choices are based on a little bit later in this lesson. So, once you have the double needle chain secured, or whatever anchor you choose to use, you're ready to start stitching. The hallmark of freeform stitching is frequent changes. So work a few stitches of a similar size or gauge, then change the size of your stitches. You might skip some links on the needle chain anchor to make a tall stitch with a big lag. Now be deliberate in your thread allocation here. Make these stitches the size you intend them to be. To help stabilize a large stitch, you can follow it with a small stitch, and that small stitch may even be pulled tight, like, think back to your beginning looping classes, like the knot that secures a wrapped base cord, that very first stitch you make when securing a wrapped base cord. Think of these big lags as bridges. As you work around a piece, when you come back to one of these, you'll be able to travel over it like a bridge. You may want to reinforce some of those bridges. You can do that by making what's called a beefy big lag. To do that, carry the thread back to where that stitch began and anchor it back there with a small stitch. Then whip the thread around the lag to beef it up. And then make another small looping stitch to secure the thread that you've whipped before you start on your merry way. Now, before I get too absorbed in just stitching, I'm going to add a second double needle chain to help me further define the space I'll be filling on this mug sheath. This time, instead of beginning with a slip knot, I'll just make a sideways figure 8 with the thread and start working the chain from those lengths. You can still use the slip knot if you want. This is just, a little shortcut that I use. This aluminum mug is even more slippery than that bar of soap we used in the lesson 2 of New Age Looping Basics. I bet you didn't think that was possible. Eventually, I'll have enough stitching to create some tension on this sheath so it's not continually slipping off the mug. But for now, it's going to be pretty loosey-goosey. It helps me to work so that I can build tension against the narrower part of a mold. It also helps to build some bridges that help hold things together. But first, I'm going to have to add thread. In this project, I'm using hand-dyed cotton rug warp for this demonstration and using the Trapped Tails thread addition method. Next, I'm going to build a bridge between the 2 double needle chains that encircle the mug. You can work the chain off the mold and then stitch the ends of the bridge to those anchor points, or you can simply start working away from one point And when that chain is long enough to reach the other anchor, secure that end and keep stitching. You've got those live edges you can stitch into, and with that new bridge, the space to be filled is further defined. We'll talk about filling that space in the next unit.